And his entire life, he heard his parents talking about coming here so that he could have a better life and have an education. For him, being an immigrant also meant having an education and going to college. Another example, also a young man who's an immigrant, who understands and has heard on the news about the DREAM Act and the fact that students who come from other countries, many of whom are undocumented, may not be able to go to college. For him, that aspect of his identity is not consistent with going to college. So it's not just the aspects of identity, but it's the meaning that people make of them and how they then make meaning of that in connection with college staying. And you can see here I put some questions that we can think about in terms of integrating different dimensions of one's identity. I'm going to shift attention here for a moment to self-concept, not because I think of it as being separate from demographics or the roles that we fill, but because the process for its development is slightly different. Some aspects of our identity we're born into. That includes many of our demographics. Some of us were born into families with particular political ideologies, and we inherit them. Others are born into a family. I'm here in Boston, so we think about the Red Sox a lot. Some people are born into Red Sox families, others Yankees. But we develop many of our identities because of the choices we make or the experiences we've had. One aspect of self-concept that has been linked to post-secondary persistence in much of the research, and we believe is central to college staying, is self-efficacy. Some of you may be familiar with this term. Some of you might think a lot about self-efficacy, and for some of you it may be new. Put very briefly, self-efficacy is the belief in our ability to succeed, particularly in a given task. Unlike self-esteem, it's not a global trait. We don't just have high levels of self-efficacy. In fact, self-efficacy is related to different things. I might have particularly high self-efficacy in being able to achieve something like lead a webinar or speak to a group of master's students. So take a moment and think about something for which you have high levels of self-efficacy. It can be in your professional life or in your personal life, maybe cooking, maybe speaking in front of large groups. Just identify something, and when you've done, please raise your hand. Great. Now for a second, please take a moment and think about something for which you think you have low levels of self-efficacy. Again, it could be cooking. And know that I'm not going to ask you to post them, but something you feel that you don't actually have high levels of self-efficacy. To give you an example, for me, one area that I have particular low self-efficacy is when it comes to directions and driving. I have very low levels. I often think that I can't find my way places. I find that I'm resistant to go places without my iPhone, and when I once lost it, was pretty reluctant to try any new routes because I realized I often felt like I'd get lost. One of the things that we need to know about self-efficacy is how it is formed. What are the ways that we develop these levels of efficacy in different domains? And you can see here, I've listed 4 things that describe what influences self-efficacy. The first is mastery of experience, having done it and done it successfully. When you do things and you're successful at it, you often feel more confident about doing it again. Your self-efficacy goes up. So I find myself lost, I work myself out of it, I arrive at my destination, and maybe I have more and more mastery of this experience, my self-efficacy in driving will increase. The second is vicarious learning. This is seeing other people doing it. For me, it's watching my husband, who never looks at directions, would never certainly stop and ask for directions, but often can find his way in a new city or state just by intuition. Just because I watch him, if I see him do it, it might make me feel like I can do it more. The third is social persuasion, having other people tell you that you are good at something. We often think of this with students. We tell them, if we tell them that they can do it, they might believe they can do it. People tell me that I can find my way downtown amidst a lot of construction in Boston, then maybe I won't feel so reluctant to drive downtown. The social persuasion also influences self-efficacy in a particular area. And the final is affective state. And the affective state simply describes the state one is in when they're trying to develop self-efficacy. Are they generally healthy, in a good mood, in a positive state, or On the contrary, are they stressed, unhappy? And when they're stressed and unhappy, it's harder to build self-efficacy in this area. So I raised self-efficacy as one example of self-concept because it's an area where we can think about students' college-staying behavior. If they don't actually have beliefs about their ability to succeed in college, it's going to be very difficult for them to develop and adopt and integrate a college-staying identity into their existing identity. I provided an overview of identity and its different dimensions and talked quite a bit about its importance for persistence. Before I move on to thinking about how we train peer advocates in this area, let me quickly mention why I think that peers are so uniquely positioned to provide support in this area. Although I think this is something you already know quite a lot about, you're all running peer advocacy programs, and Connect to Connect is based on the importance of peers. However, when thinking about peers in particular with regard to identity, it's important to sort of note why your peer advocates are going to be so well positioned to engage in this work. First is that peers matter a lot during adolescence, and I often think of adolescence as heading into 18, 19 as well, 19, 20 years old even. When we think about the importance of peers, we know that college students rely on one another for social support. We know that they rely on them for information. What we don't often know is that one's identity is shaped by peer affirmation and approval. When we think about this, we see that peers often are more likely to adopt an identity if they see their peers doing it, because their peers affirm it in many ways. And they set some of the norms up for a culture or for a community on campus. So when we think about peers helping students shape their identity, we know that they're already doing it in some way, shape, or form, usually unintentionally. Training peer advocates in this area is about training them to do so intentionally. We do this because we can think about belief systems and how they believe in their ability. But also we do this by creating space for the C2C students' narratives to form, the narrative about their identities, with the support of their peer advocates. So peer advocates can create the space, both in individual settings as well as group settings, to engage in the kinds of conversations that get to self-efficacy, and in helping understand what aspects of their identity are most salient, and more importantly, identify where there may be conflicts, different dimensions of their identity. So let me shift here to training peer advocates and thinking about how do we do this. One of the unique things about training peer advocates in an area like identity development and self-concept is that your peer advocates are going to benefit from this training just as much as they will benefit the C2C students. So what we're looking to do is thinking about how we help your peer advocates themselves bring into awareness their college-staying identity. Once they have that into their awareness, then they can develop some tools for doing the same thing with their C2C students. So more specifically, thinking about training peer advocates, we're talking about them developing the same kinds of developmental experiences, bringing aspects of their self-concept into awareness, and then giving them the tools to engage in conversations about identity, but particularly to be on the lookout for incongruence or low levels of self-efficacy. This, of course, requires that they understand those concepts, and the best way for them to understand them is really to have those kinds of experiences where those aha moments, understanding their levels of self-efficacy in different domains. One of the most important, I would say, ways for students to become aware of self-concept is for them to get feedback about what they do well and areas to improve. An important provider of that information is, in fact, peers. So what does it look like to train peer advocates? It begins with reflection. And I posted here some questions that you could consider. Certainly don't need to be limited to these. But these questions, like what aspects of my identity are most salient, are the kinds of things that address the topics I've covered so far. Where does my own personal narrative intersect with this work? For a peer advocate, what parts of their identity are tied up in why they want to be a peer advocate? And how do I think about my own self-concept? Where are their high levels of self-efficacy? And can they understand that they may not be the same for their students, their C2C students? But the last one, the final question, is important because it gets not just at the roles they've assumed or the pieces of their self-concept, but also where they came from and how they were formed. Were they externally imposed by society or by a family member? Understanding where their self-concept came from and what meaning they make of different dimensions of identity creates an opportunity or sets the stage for rethinking them or considering their accuracy. With their own awareness in mind, the peer advocates can then separate their own understanding of their identity from their work. And this is an important part of the process. Very often in my work training graduate students to do counseling or advising, we find that they oftentimes will project their own experiences onto others. So an important part of this process for peer advocates is not just to become aware of their identity, but also then to separate that they're not expecting that, say, for example, just because they share the same race or they share the same gender, that that's the part of one's identity that's most salient to them. When they're able to take themselves and their experiences out of the process, they can consider how they'll engage differently with their C2C students. So it begins with reflection, shifts towards intentionality. This is a hard process. I teach this to my graduate students, and even when teaching them, they still sometimes find them putting themselves and their own experiences in the context of their work with their students. And finally, anytime we do training and we begin with a reflection, creating time for planning, for thinking creatively about how and when there are opportunities for using these new tools in their work. Because some of these tools don't come in the form of programming. They come in the form of everyday conversations, talking with students about who they are and where they came from. Suzanne and I have provided Shauna and the Campus Compact with 2 sample lessons for using identity in the teaching peer advocates and the training, some of the ideas we've presented here. I wanted to give you a little bit of an idea of what they include. I should say first, however, that there's not just one way to teach these ideas that I've presented today. We've pulled out some specific bits of information that we think are most useful and most learnable in short amount of time. But they give you a basic concept for thinking about how you can create a training module or a lesson with your peer advocates. And you'll see here the 3 objectives that I set up, is that we want peer advocates to be able to identify aspects of his or her own identity within the 3 spheres. We want them to figure out, how do they understand their identity, and can they begin to expand upon their understanding of their own narrative. Second, we want peer advocates to be able to begin to identify where there's integration across different dimensions, things we take for granted. What are the different dimensions of my identity that fit well together, even though I may not have had to work hard to fit them together? And finally, we want the peer advocates to have a chance to practice how identity might enter into the relationship. We want these to be experiential so that peer advocates have the kind of aha moments that they want their C2 students to have. And one of the examples that we offer is an activity where students actually locate the different dimensions of their identity. They break up their self-concept from their demographics and the roles that they fill, and have a chance to think about where those aspects and dimensions of their identity came from. So with that, I think I'll pause and open up for questions. So I'm going to turn things back over to Shauna, who's going to facilitate the Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Mandy, for that presentation. Just to kick off the Q&A, I wanted to ask you, Mandy, why do you think people aren't using this developmental approach more widely?
I think that's a good question.
And sorry, so folks, this is the time to start typing into the chat box any questions you have, and then I'll be looking at those questions and we'll be addressing as many of those as we're able to. So this is the time, as Mandy's addressing this question I just asked, for you to write in questions, and then in the send to box, select send to all participants.
So to your question as to why more people may not be using this developmental approach, I have 2 thoughts. And one is, the good news is that the response to our book has been so positive that people really weren't able to see the links between development and the work they do in college readiness and support, in that the information that's out there is largely based on information and academic support. And to add to that, most folks who are engaged in this work don't have a background in psychology or even development, and so they haven't been trained to think and act in this way. And even for those who have it, as I said, the links weren't made clear. I think that's the first part. And the second part is, I think oftentimes paying attention to development seems secondary to many of the other supports that are believed to be important. And I certainly wouldn't want to take away from the other kinds of things that are in place across the country on many campuses. They're all important forms of support. Our belief, however, is that when these developmental processes and traits are not well formed, there's a foundation that's missing. And we believe that when we can pay attention to and attend to these other developmental processes, then young people or college students are better able to engage in institutions in a thoughtful and more productive manner.
Thank you. We're just waiting to load in the questions. What questions folks have, if you can give us a minute. Okay, I haven't received any questions yet, so if you can all go to the chat box, open up the chat box, and in the message section, type in your questions, and then under the send to, put all attendees. If for some reason you can't send it to all attendees, you can send it to all panelists. And the slides and the recording will be made available to all participants afterwards, just so you know.
Donna, I think when presenting this kind of information, sometimes it takes a while to sort of sink in. I've offered a lot of different ideas here. Self-efficacy for some was a new concept, and it's thinking about, can we teach self-efficacy? Is there something we can do to build it? And, the answer is yes. So I think in some ways, there are ways to think about how this gets integrated into peer advocacy training, but also how it shapes your everyday experiences when you listen for conflict in different parts of identity or listening for perceptions of low self-efficacy. So I think it takes some time to think about the widespread application of this.
Okay, great. So I'm going to just raise one of the questions that just came in, and we'll get to them. So could you recommend a resource that we could use to explore the issue of self-concept in the classroom? Ideally, it would be a compact lesson of exercises that might be used on the first day of classes.
This is Suzanne. Hi, it's nice to virtually meet you all, and we're so thrilled, as Mandy said, to be here with you. This is a great question, and as Mandy mentioned, we have put together 2 lessons that we've shared with Shauna that she will share with all of you that are curricula lessons that you can use with your students. One of them is particularly focused on self-concept, and I think that will be really useful for you. It includes discussion questions as well as some activities and some reflection exercises that you can do with students. So I think that's a really good place to start. There are more resources out there that are for younger students as well, but I think that probably for the college classroom, what we've found is that there's not a lot of this kind of material that already exists. So we will be sending those around, and then at the beginning of our next webinar, we are hoping to have a chance to take your questions about your use of those lessons and if there's any other support we can provide on that.
Thank you, Suzanne.
So one of the questions that came in was about whether this has applications to your school or for your school. And the truth is, when we've created this framework, we're not focused on any one setting. In fact, we looked at a K-16 approach, thinking very much about two-year schools as well as K-12 institutions. The big difference, I think, is in terms of the kinds of identity that students bring, not so much the context that they're in. If the goal remains the same, to help students persist and succeed on your campus, then thinking about the aspects of identity you want to help sort of inculcate in the students you're working with, it means understanding who they are. So part of becoming developmentally aware means individualizing your approach, differentiating the approach. Certainly not everybody who comes to a two-year school will be 18 and leaving home and crossing the state, but understanding what they are bringing with them to the campus in terms of what expectations they have about becoming a college graduate is I think how it can be applied in any setting.
I think one of the things that's really interesting and important about this developmental approach is that it informs all stages of the college-going process, from the time that students are very young and are beginning to explore the idea of college, through college, whether that being a 2-year or a 4-year institution, and beyond. So we think that these issues of identity are important to getting to college, they're important to completing college, and they're also really important to planning for the future. So regardless of what type of institution you're working in or your students are in, there's also a piece of this that's about thinking about my future and how my concept of who I am fits in with what I'm going to do after I leave here. And for some of your students, that might be transitioning from a 2-year college to a 4-year college. And for others, it might be thinking about career and what's next for them.
Great, thank you.
So there's a question here about using the developmental approach in a more time-limited space. I'm going to interpret that as meaning you may not have them in a class or in terms of training the peer advocates.
Maybe you could type in a little bit more detail to help us. We're on speakerphone, so we appreciate the comment about the difference in speakers, and we're going to try to get a little closer to the phone, so thanks for raising that. On the question about time-limited opportunities to address this, if that person who asked that question could provide just a little bit more detail to help us guide our answer.
And in the meantime, if there are any other questions, if folks want to raise those by typing them into the chat box, that'd be great. And maybe I'll ask a question while we'll give other folks time to reflect if that's needed. Mandy, I was just wondering if maybe you could describe a little bit more about the lessons that you're going to be providing and maybe how they might be used and adapted.
Sure. So the first lesson that I mentioned, it gives students a chance to explore different dimensions of their identity in the 3 areas that I mentioned, in the demographics, in the roles that they play, and in their self-concept. One of the things that we know is that students, young people, adolescents, young adults, all form their identity based on experiences they've had. And what we're looking for is for them to become aware of how things get formed, just bringing into awareness some of the invisible processes. So many of us have developed aspects of our identity without even being aware of it. And so a good example of this is when students begin to believe some stereotypes about themselves, whether they're good in math or that because their race is not necessarily believed to be good in a particular subject, or that it is, that they internalize different ideas about themselves. And so giving students a chance to sort of map out the different parts of their identity, they have a chance to see different parts and think about where they came from. So part of that activity will include students looking at where across the board within their peers they can see different dimensions of identity that maybe they haven't thought about in themselves, but in fact are there. So your question about when you only have a small amount of time, thank you so much for adding to this. When you only have a small amount of interaction with the training and it's very condensed, that you have to work with the PAs, it could be very much in the form of being engaging in conversation with PAs about what parts of their identity have helped them become a college student and help them in their everyday experience on campus, or even get them through. So engaging in questions, we have some reflection questions in the lesson, one of which is, can you think about different things that have helped you along your way? And part of the process is just giving them a chance to think about the importance those dimensions of identity have played. So I think it can happen if you don't have a lot of time with them in just having those conversations. It might be, however, that what you take from this is not about a specific modular training, but maybe a set of questions that you offer your peer advocates on a piece of paper that they think about using with their C2C students. So you may not have a chance to give them all of the background content and just give them strategies. I think we believe that the best way to teach this so that people are most successful with it is to give background information and then give them the strategies so they have some idea of why they're doing what they're doing. This sets people up to be able to troubleshoot if things don't work well. It also gives more meaning to what they're doing. But if you don't have the time to teach them about self-efficacy, I think what you can also do is give them guided questions to use with their C2C students that will get at those kinds of things. Would you add anything, Suzanne?
Yeah, I think the other thing that I would add is that some of this is not about doing specific activities, but it's about modeling how you interact with the peer advocates on a day-to-day basis so that they can then model those, they can then use those same things with their mentees. And what I mean by that is that some of the ways that we as adults promote self-efficacy, self-concept, a strong college-staying identity aren't necessarily from doing an activity that's focused on it, but instead paying attention to how those things come out in how we talk to our students. So take, for example, self-efficacy. When Mandy was talking about self-efficacy, he distinguished it from global self-esteem. And one of the important differences is that self-efficacy is really about believing that you have the ability to do something if you try. And that's different than believing I'm good at something. I was born good at this. I was not born good at this. It's really about, it's a much more empowering concept. And there are things that we can all do to build the self-efficacy of the students that we work with. And that includes seeking opportunities in interacting with them to show them ways in which they have been successful, to encourage them that they can improve the work that they do, for example, their academic work or possibly their work with students, to really empower them to understand that to help them develop their self-efficacy and help them build their self-efficacy. And the wonderful and also tricky thing about all of this developmental work, particularly some of the motivation and self-regulation issues that we'll talk about in the next webinar, is that for it to really take hold, it has to be embedded in the everyday interactions that we have with each other. And so that's something that we all just kind of need to be aware of, and as Mandy said, really listen for those things when we're interacting with students.
Thanks, Suzanne. So we had another question come in. Do you have any readings that you recommend to open or prepare for these conversation or activities?
So I know there are a couple of things I might recommend, and we can make readings available to Shauna and to the folks at Campus Compact, as well as we'll certainly make these slides available. The first, certainly, we have a couple of questions in our book that you could take a look at. Each of our chapters ends with a set of recommendations for practice that I think would be useful. The second is a couple of the things we've talked about with regard to self-concept and self-efficacy. I think that many of the literature on that topic hasn't been applied to practice in such a useful way, but there are a couple of things, one of which is I've enjoyed the work of Claude Steele, who writes about stereotype threat, which gets at different conflicts of identity in his most recent book, Whistling Vivaldi. I think he offers some very nice ways of using language and engaging with people about potential conflicts of identity. And the other person that I'd recommend, although again, it's not necessarily written for educators, but it's very, very useful, is the work of Daphne Oyserman, O-Y-S-E-R-M-A-N. Daphne Oyserman works on, she's developed a concept called possible selves, and she uses this idea that people develop different possible selves for their future. And she breaks the possible selves up into three kinds: expected selves, hoped for selves, and feared selves. And her belief is that when students or people have some balance between their hoped-for selves and their feared selves, then they're able to act more intently on what they hope to, on a particular goal or their future intention. And Daphne's work, what it brings to mind for us is how we help people think about the difference between a hoped-for self and an expected self. Like, I might set a goal for myself that I hope will happen, but the truth is I really don't expect it to happen. And the difference between the two, the hope and the expected, is really about what I believe is possible and believing about what I am capable of. So I think her work might also be helpful in thinking about how you have these conversations and what language you use with students.
There's another question here about belief and identity. I'm going to read the question in case you can't see it. It says, in training peer advocates, you find the elements of self-identity have the potency of belief, or are students open to new ideas as they might be about something that they think? I'm going to take a shot at this. I hope I understand the question correctly. I think there's an important link between what we believe about ourselves and what we believe about our ability to set goals and then ultimately to achieve those goals. And what we know from the psychology research is that the foundation for setting goals and for ultimately achieving them is believing that they are important to you, so there's a set of values, believing that they are possible, and that is in part where the self-efficacy comes in, and also believing that they are not only possible but desirable and attainable. So in terms of believing versus thinking, people sometimes use those terms interchangeably, but I'm here when we think about what we believe about ourselves, psychology research would suggest that that does in fact influence what we think about what we take on, what we do, those kinds of things. I hope that answers that question.
Thank you, Suzanne. So, I think that we have answered all of the questions. Some folks have asked about getting the slides in advance in advance of the next webinar. And I think that will be possible, so we could send those out to you. I will be sending out the lessons by the end of the day tomorrow. And is there anything else, Sandy or Suzanne, you wanted to add before we close?
I would add two things. One, if you take a look at the lessons and you have questions, as Suzanne said, bring questions to the next webinar. We'll leave a little bit of time to answer questions. There'll be 2 lessons that you'll be sent that accompany this webinar, and then another 2 that will come following the next webinar. So I think you might want to use the first set to generate any questions you have about the concepts or the applicability into a module framework. And the second is, as we begin to think about the second webinar, if you have reactions or thoughts about this kind of material or applications you'd like us to address, please feel free to send them to Shauna, and we'll do our best to address that.
And finally, I'll be sending out a link to SurveyMonkey just so that we can get your feedback on the webinar. This is our first webinar that we've done, and so I wanted to thank you for being patient with us with the technology, and I also wanted to really thank you for taking time out of your day to participate in the webinar. I hope that you found it useful and that you'll come out with some lessons that you can apply directly to your work with the peer advocates. So with that being said, I think we'll end the call, and thank you